こんにちは、ピクテジャパンの萩野です。本日はグローバルインカム株式ファンドのファンドマネージャー、ブルーノリッペンさんにお越しいただいてお話を聞こうと思っています。来年の2月末にですね、グローバルインカム株式ファンドは運用開始以来20周年を迎えます。彼はその大部分の期間をですね、運用してきたメインファンドマネージャーがございまして、ジュネーブにおけるスペシャルエクイティチームのヘッドでもあります。彼から公益株、投資の魅力、あと今どういうタイミングなのかということを今日はお話をお伺いしたいと思います。Okay, Bruno, thank you very much for today actually. So one of the key questions what I have is what is exactly Global Income Equity Fund?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me in Tokyo, Hagi. The Global Income Equity Fund is a global fund that invests in the shares of utilities around the world. And the reason why we invest in utilities around the world is that they are very stable businesses with low risk and that provide very predictable sources of income that allows us to pay a dividend to our shareholders.
So what is the key attractiveness for individual investors, not from institutional investors? What is, to look for the investing in the global utility equities?
I think global utility equities give you the perfect blend between stable growth and very contained risk. So these are businesses that don't go through massive cycles, but that benefit from the steady growth of using more and more electricity to power up things like electric vehicles, like data centers, like warming our homes. So you have very linear growth, and that then allows us to pay a dividend every year or every quarter. Since the inception of the fund, we've been paying a steady stream of dividends, and we expect that to continue to do so and grow that slightly over time as well.
Also, dividend yield is higher than the usual equity?
It is, because these companies are very profitable, have very solid balance sheets. That they can afford themselves to come up with predictable yields because there's very low volatility in how their businesses go. Risky businesses need to keep a big cash buffer to live through a downturn.
Sometimes changing dividend level.
Exactly. Yeah. Utilities don't have these massive downturns, so they can afford to pay predictable dividends.
So it means that if individual investors invest in the utility equities, then 10 years later, dividend level may be higher than the first year.
Yes, that's for sure.
I think this is one of the key attractiveness as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because dividend will be paid every year, right?
Absolutely.
So that will be one of stabilized income for the investors.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Dividend grows in line with the growth of the underlying economy, basically.
I see. So you talk about the AI demands. That your AI uses a lot of electricity.
Absolutely.
And will that affect on the utility sectors in terms of business and performance in the future?
It has a massive impact already today.
Already today?
Already today. So the utility industry, the demand for electricity has barely grown for 20 years.
Right.
So between 2000 and 2020, it was a flat demand because we're more and more efficient. We had better light bulbs. We had more efficient equipment. That it was flat but not growing. Since we started to use more and more electricity to drive our cars, to electrify the economy, we've seen an inflection. And then the AI that came in since the beginning of this year has really tilted the curve of this demand. So there is a very strong growth in the need for electricity, and that is pushing up the economics for our companies. It's pushing up power prices that the data centers are paying to our companies, and it's allowing them to grow because they need to build more networks and more plants to connect these data centers.
So there are a lot of investment in the AI, but actually there's a facility that do not start operating yet, right?
Exactly. And that's the interesting part, Hagi. Did you know that to build a 1 gigawatt data center costs about $10 billion to build the infrastructure? And then it costs about $25 billion to buy the NVIDIA chips to put in. So they spend 35 billion to build the infrastructure, but they need electricity to make it work.
Yeah, that's why last year, big, large-scale software companies, they try to invest in electricity, right?
Exactly.
Will that continue?
We think it will, because all of these plants that they are building now, all of them will need electricity, and they need a lot of electricity.
The situation right now, not exactly similar, but like in 1995 to 1999, after Windows 95 was launched, a lot of the new, online business or whatever start taking off. At that time also demand for electricity increased, right?
Yes.
Then when I checked the stock price of global utility equities in database, from the end of 1994 to 1998, 4 years, the annual growth was almost 15.7%.
Yeah.
That's a massive growth rate in terms of equity returns.
Yeah.
But do you think similar, this time AI demand is bigger than compared to in 1990 times?
That is a very good question. I think it could very well be, because it's not just AI. Like AI is very positive, let there be no mistake. But there's also electric vehicles.
You're right.
As people buy their cars, they need to charge them every day. There's also electrification of industry. People want to convert from coal to electricity, so that's pushing up demand. Heating in houses, people want to go from gas to electricity. So all of these things, the electrification of the economy is pushing up the growth for the entire industry. And AI is an important factor, but it's not the only factor.
Okay.
It's a very broad-based source of growth. And because of that, it could be more sustainable and more attractive than it was in the late 1990s.
Okay, compared with late of 1990s. Well, also that you said last year already, demand start coming out. Is this also the reason that the earnings per share, last year, profit for last year utility sectors has been growing in the past 2 years? Is that affected by last year AI demand? Or?
It absolutely is.
Oh, really?
If you look at this industry, you mentioned the late 1990s, but you could go back even further and you could look at the 1970s, for example. We talk about long cycles, but that's the beauty of this industry because they are predictable. In the 1970s, we came off the back of an oil crisis, and we converted onto things like nuclear and natural gas.
Right.
That was a decade of very strong growth for the utility industries because they were investing in new technologies and building out the infrastructure, and that's pushing up the earnings. We've seen the same thing happening in the late 1990s with the build out of the communications infrastructure and much more natural gas still being built. And then we had a period of low growth. And now, since a couple of years, we're building out renewables. And there's the demand from AI coming and the electrification coming. So we think this is a 10-year cycle that we just embarked upon. And that will go on for several years to come.
I think not so many people in Japan do not recognize this mood, this tendency yet, actually. So I think this is a really important point to think about as your utility equity investment.
Well, I would say it's not just in Japan, Hagi. I think a lot of people have been focused on the technology stocks and the semiconductor stocks. And they haven't really made this connection that all of this requires electricity. And you see it in valuations. Our sector, when we compare it to the market, is typically between 0.8 and 1.2 times the valuation of the market. So it's a broad range. Today we are at 0.8.
You mean relatively cheap?
Very cheap compared to the overall market.
In terms of valuation comparison.
In terms of valuation comparison. So we're at the lower points in this cycle, and this has started to turn a little bit, and it should continue because the growth is very predictable and very attractive.
I see. After Trump won the presidential election, the long-term interest rate hiked a lot. Then utility equity affected by this?
Somewhat. I personally think that interest rates hiked up because people are worried about inflation. And I think there's two types of inflation. There's good inflation and bad inflation. If inflation goes up because the economy is growing, I would call that good inflation. And that's something we shouldn't be too worried about because it drives earnings growth. And utilities can benefit from that type of inflation because electricity prices will go up and they will capitalize on it and it will drive earnings growth. Bad inflation would be if you have an economic collapse because the government balance sheet is out of control. And that is something that would be negative, but I don't think that that is the scenario that we're in right now.
Well, in the past almost 1 month, U.S. long-term interest rates increased a lot, right? That affect on last year global utility equity price. Normally, all the time, once long-term interest rates hike, then the utility stock have been affected by
Yes.
that. But how long do you think the current market correction phase will last?
That is a very difficult prediction to make. I can't exactly put my alarm on it. But all I can say is that the earnings growth is accelerating. Every time we go back and talk to our companies, the earnings projections they give us are better than the last time we spoke to them. And inflation and interest rates don't really impact their business model a lot because they pass it on to their consumers and they grow their earnings because of it. So if share prices come down and the earnings keep on growing, I would say that's an opportunity.
To buy
low.
Level.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much. So finally, this year, would you say, the final message to the end investors, please?
Yes, with pleasure. First of all, I am very happy to be back in Tokyo with my fabulous colleagues. I always like coming to this country and to this city. And I do think that given the outlook for utilities and given what we just talked about, today is a fantastic time to be a shareholder in the utility industry. And to be a shareholder in Gloin, and I thank you very much for your interest and in your support for our product.
はい。最後にですね、グローバルインカム株式ファンド、立ち上げたのも、私だったんですけども、今過去20年間の中でですね、需要の拡大、AI に基づく、あとバリエーションが今この PR16 倍程度っていうのはなかなか魅力的な水準だと思いますので、ぜひですね、時間がありましたらうちのホームページ等を見ていただいて、情報等を確認していただけるとありがたいです。本日はありがとうございました。Thank you very much today.
Thank you, Aggie.
Thank you.